Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker-Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process and for authors to learn valuable tips on producing and marketing your audiobooks. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Thanks for being with me today. We're going to talk about the question, and sort of addressing the question of, is your book right for a full cast audiobook? And we're also going to look at some ways that you can figure that out on your own. It's always good to get some expert opinion on that question, especially if you're unclear about it. But let's jump in and talk about what kind of stories benefit most from full cast. So one of the things that I've found is that the most frequent kind of full cast project, they typically land in some kind of adventure type story. Now, that is not to say that others don't also or couldn't also benefit from the full cast approach. So first, let's talk about the more typical, and then we'll go into what can be sometimes the exceptions, the outliers from what is more typical. So with a manuscript that is, has a lot of action in it, these are typically the kinds of projects where, imagine that movie in your mind. That's what people think of when they think of, and what is, it's what it's like for a full cast immersive soundtrack. It is literally like a movie in your mind. And so in these kinds of projects, we have, we'll hear, for example, the atmosphere. And what I mean there is, for example, if the characters are indoors, it'll sound like they're indoors. If they're in a forest, it'll sound like they're in a forest. These are subtle kinds of sounds, but they really set the tone and they give you that immersive feeling. Additionally, above and beyond that atmospheric kind of sound, that ambiance, then we're looking at things like sound effects. So if somebody is tearing out of the driveway, a gravel driveway in a car, we'll hear the sound of their tires on that and the squeals or whatever sounds would be appropriate for that moment. Again, this is helping to support the story and immerse the listener in that story, because as they hear the words of the story, they're also hearing the sounds that fit those words, fit the storyline and what's happening. Now, there's a real fine balance when it comes to, whether you do absolutely every sound that might be heard. That can get a little overwhelming for the listener. So you're really looking for a really good balance of what's going to create the very best listener experience. Another thing that film also uses very effectively is music. Music in appropriate places where it maybe is helping to support the building of tension, or maybe it's setting the scene, or maybe it's just a transition from one scene to another scene. These are all ways in which music can be really beneficial. So coming back to that question of what kinds of stories benefit, again, many of them are, more active plot line, okay? Now, one of the other things that makes a big difference in that decision about whether your manuscript is appropriate for a full cast project is you want to look at what is the balance between the narrative text and the dialogue. And that balance, when it is much more dialogue driven, those are the ones that typically are going to really benefit from the full cast. And Now let me talk just a little bit about a couple things here. One is the number of people in a scene. Okay, so I want to cover that. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about point of view narration and dialogue and how some different options there. First of all, when we're talking about scenes where there are a lot of different characters in the scene, it can be harder for a single narrator to differentiate the many voices that are included within that scene. And so that is something to take a look at when you're looking at your own manuscript and figuring that out. On another point is, just to round that out, that the having multiple voices doing the different characters within the scene can help the listener to keep track of the fact that they're different people and who those different people are. Now, when it comes to just fewer people in the scene, which typically are a little easier to write also because you're not dealing with quite so many characters and what's going on with all of those different people. But regardless of how you've written your manuscript, when you have just a few people in a scene or two people in a scene, one of the benefits of having the dialogue with different actors is that they can really convey from a performance point of view, they can really convey the interplay between the characters. And here's what I'm trying to highlight here is that is going to have one take on the different characters in a scene. So let's say a single narrator is going to have their perception of the scene and how it plays out between the two characters. When you introduce another performer into that mix, then you have a real genuine additional point of view, additional person to play off of. It really makes it so much more genuine in a way, because you're not, as opposed to trying to step into the shoes of one person, then the shoes of the other person, and one person is making all those decisions. Then with a full cast, you have that additional input, that additional insight, and all of that raises the level of the storytelling. That's not to say anything against single voice narration. I don't mean that. But what we're looking at today is, for those people who feel like they might want to have their audiobook as a full cast audiobook, what are these kind of criteria or things to look at when you're considering that decision? So that's I just wanted to focus on that for a moment. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about point of view and how that can change, and some different options for point of view narration. Now, if you have a book where your characters, or where the narration is spoken from different character points of view, this is a really good reason to move forward with some kind of multi-voiced production. It's a really good way for your listeners to be able to follow whose head they're in, right? Who is the narrative voice in any given chapter? And that's a really great way to do that. Now, within that, you have another option. If you have a fair amount of dialogue throughout the book, you might want those other characters, who may also have their own points of view, character narrations, you may want them speaking their own dialogue. And then it really steps into that full cast immersive experience. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be that you have multiple points of view for the narration, and each narrator is performing the voices of the other characters who are narrating their own chapters. So to clarify, hopefully, it means one narrator would read an entire chapter, including all dialogue, and another actor would do, their own character point of view, full chapter. So it's a different version of a multi-voiced project, and either one, they work really well together. Again, if it is a manuscript with a lot of dialogue, then I would tend to lean toward the full cast option. Okay? All right. So sometimes let's look at the reverse. When is it a sign that your audiobook might be better off with a single narrator? Well, first of all, I will say if you're looking at full cast narration, you do need to be aware it is a much more expensive process. It's creating a much more complex and enriched and wonderful experience, but it is, there is a price tag that goes with that. With a single narrator project, the kinds of things that I look for as to whether that is indicated by the manuscript is, first of all, how much dialogue is there? If there's not that much dialogue, then I would definitely lean towards single narrator. Unless, of course, it's multiple points of view, right? Okay. If it has a moderate amount of dialogue and maybe most of the dialogue is between two people, maybe three people, this again is a situation where it might just do very well with a single narrator. All right. There are some other things that I look at, but those are the biggest things that I pay attention to when I'm looking at a manuscript to determine whether it would be best with a single narrator or with multiple narrators, and when with multiple narrators, whether full cast or whether just voiced by point of view chapter. Okay. So a little more, let me talk just a little bit about the difference between multi-voice narration and that true immersive audio drama. I did talk about it a little bit in terms of that multi-voice narration brings in multiple voices, but it is not the intersplicing, if you will, of dialogue. There is not between narrator characters, different narrator characters, there is not interaction specifically between those people as their characters in a dialogue. It is for just multi-voiced, it is one narrator reading all the voices for their chapter, and immersive audio drama, or full cast, as I like to call it, it is where all of the dialogue is narrated by a performer, and each character has their own voice, their own actor voice. I want to clarify also that with full cast productions, we always do some doubling, tripling, sometimes multiple characters for a single actor, depending on what those characters require. In other words, for the very small roles, the one-off, taxi driver line, or, you have some guy that shows up at the door or whatever, where they're not main characters. They're very minor characters. Those are lines that can be picked up and, by one of the other actors already in the cast. Generally, what we try to do for the primary characters, the main protagonist, that we want ideally to have them be just that voice, just that character. And then for secondary, we start having those people pick up some of those extra lines, and then the minor characters, the very minor ones, those we might have an extra one or two cast members who are really just doing everyone else, like all the extras, depending on their flexibility with their voice. So a lot of things going on. Let's just take a short pause. We'll come right back.
Do you have a book that you imagine with multiple voices, or a screenplay or stage play? At Pro Audio Voices, we love working on these more complex productions with music and sound effects and a full cast of voices. Bringing together decades of experience in both theatre and audio production, our team brings your project to life. From manuscript preparation, to casting, to directing the actors, and a post-production team to bring it all together, Pro Audio Voices brings your project to life. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com/full-cast.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the budget ranges and some of the ways in which this having the full cast can play out. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, full cast, even multi-voiced, is a more expensive option. Full cast immersive is the most expensive option. So just head into it being aware of that. Here are some of the things that make the biggest difference in additional cost. One of the biggest is the cast size. That's for a couple reasons. One is that, first of all, the casting process is much more complex and involved when we have many actors that are going to be a part of the cast. Another is the scheduling of all of those actors. So there's quite a bit of complexity involved just in making sure that all of those people who are in scenes together are going to be able to record those together. That the recording together is something that we at Pro Audio Voices really care a lot about, because we do believe that it makes a huge difference in the end quality of the audiobook, and really is the very best way to produce an audiobook for the full cast version. So coming back to what are the expensive pieces, so it's the casting process, it's the scheduling process, it's the preparation of the recording sessions itself is very complicated, and we always aim to be as efficient as we possibly can with our actors' time. But then for every actor who is going to be in a session, then, that's additional cost. So if you have 5 actors in a 1-hour session, you're paying for 5 hours of time. If you have 2 actors, you're paying for 2 actors' time. And so this is where it can get, when you have a lot of actors in a lot of scenes, that's where that price tag starts to climb. All right. So some ways then to sort of rein that cost in a little bit can be compressing how many people are going to be in the cast. That is something you want to balance with the understanding that you're going to be better off when people aren't speaking to themselves in the same scene, because you start to lose some of the benefit of the full cast when you have the same actors talking to themselves as different characters. So that is that balance point, and that the push and pull between budget and sort of optimal experience. And then I just want to say one other thing before we wrap up for this episode, is that when you have a full cast project, you actually have a tremendously greater leverage with your audiobook in terms of your marketing, because all of the people in your cast have an interest in promoting the audiobook because it's their work. And that's what narrators want to be doing. They want to be doing more work. They want to get their work out there. That's part of what they're up to and why it matters to them. So when you have a single narrator, you have that one other person, and you do have other people on your team, obviously, your project manager, and an audio engineer. There are a few people involved. But when you get to that full cast where you have more narrators, and the narrators really are the ones who, like actors, we like to be on stage, So we appreciate, we look for opportunities to get ourselves out there in the world. And that's why having multiple narrators from a marketing perspective can be really beneficial. So I'm going to wrap it up for this episode. I want to thank you so much for being with me. If you have questions about whether your manuscript might be a good candidate for a full cast production, then please do reach out to us. It is one of our favorite kinds of projects to do, and we do them a really great job with them. So just reach out to us at proaudiovoices.com. You can book a free discovery call. We'll take a look at your manuscript. We'll talk through the possibilities and what it might take to get your book into a full cast immersive project. Or if that's not the most appropriate path for it, what it would take to produce the very best version of your book in audio. Again, thank you so much for being with me today. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.